There you go.
Well, too, great start. Hello, everyone. My name is Titus Underwood. I am principal of the Nashville Symphony. I'm also associate professor at the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. I am one of the founding members of Valentine and on the steering committee and a bunch of other stuff in between, I guess. I feel like I need 3 Tituses, but I don't want to meet the other 2. But anyway, maybe some weird parallel universe or something. Anyways, I'm here joined by Alan Valentine, who's the CEO of Nashville Symphony, where I work, and also Jonathan Martin, who's in Cincinnati Symphony's CEO. And I would say I live in both of those cities practically, so it's kind of appropriate for me to talk to both of you. So welcome, both of you. We're going to be talking about leading with integrity. Like, what are the things that we need to do to move forward? I mean, both of you have so much experience in this space. Have been really pushing forward for things to change in your individual orchestras, and we're just gonna get to the meat of it and get to the conversation. So I guess the first thing I wanna ask is, what are the things that have worked with your, let's start from that note. What has worked, Alan, with Nashville as far as contractual work or community work, and then we'll talk about the things that maybe have not worked or things we could work on.
I'll start by saying that in Nashville, as we came out of the pandemic, one of the things that we did is we adopted a number of the NAV's guidelines that you saw and discussed earlier. Not 100% of them. There's a couple of provisions that were suggested in those guidelines that are sort of contradictory with each other. One, the screen being up until the very end, and then the concept of also doing an interview process to learn more about the candidate. But we did agree to a number of changes in our agreement, our CBA, and even going back prior to the pandemic, we actually implemented the idea of screens being up all the way to the very end of the audition. A number of those provisions from NAS have worked. In fact, our first audition after adopting those guidelines resulted in the hiring of Will Leathers as our new principal trumpet. He's incredible. And so that process really worked well. On the other hand, there are certain aspects of those provisions that haven't worked for us. And one of those, I would say, is the notion that we when it comes to inviting candidates into the semifinal round of auditions, which we now have the ability to do, there's language that actually says that the audition committee and the association can, by mutual agreement, invite up to 8 candidates into the semifinal round of auditions, bypassing the preliminaries, provided that at least 50% of those candidates have to be candidates who would advance the goals of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so that has not gotten a lot of traction in the auditions we've done since that trumpet audition. Simply because the committee and the association couldn't reach an agreement about those things. But I would say that, the proof that some of those concepts works was that very first audition right out of the gate. But I think that this work, and it is a very complicated process. And I would say that for us, we have a long way to go in terms of the way that we need to bring everybody in the institution into alignment in terms of their understanding of the goals, the reasons why. And to that end, we're working with a number of consultants, including Alex Lang and some of his colleagues, now on organizational culture, trying to create that alignment. One of the things Michelle said earlier about the democratic nature of collective bargaining, of course, has had some impact on all of that. There's a lot of fear around change, I would say. And so, we've been very intentional, and that's the word I want to use. So, if you don't hear anything else, is that we've been very intentional about how we've approached this work. Clearly, making changes in the CBA is one set of issues that we have to address, but the other set of issues really is to help everybody reach a new level of understanding about the importance of this work, about the things that prevent us from being successful in doing this work, and we've got to find ways together to move forward. And so I know Titus knows this because, you know, I called you, very early on.
Yeah, 2017.
Yeah, and said, hey, could I take you to lunch or dinner or something and just pick your brain a little bit? And I asked him, you know, what are some ideas that you think would help us move this forward? That was even before the NAS guidelines were out. And it was really helpful. You know, I said, you know, I know this isn't your problem to solve, it's our problem to solve, but you know, I was looking for advice. And by the way, before I forget, and before I give you the mic, I do want to say thank you for inviting us to talk here today. And I want to tell you that I found everything that's happened so far today to be really inspiring and informative. And I feel like I'm here as much to learn as I am to talk. And so I just want to say that, you know, it's a real privilege to be here today and to be here with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Jonathan. Yeah.
So the question is, what's worked? And I assume the next question will be, what hasn't?
What hasn't worked?
So if you look at an orchestra through the lens of what are the constituents of an orchestra? You got the board, you got the staff, you got the musicians, volunteers. Of course, the audience is an important external constituency. What has largely worked in terms of changing the organization and changing the culture have been with the things that are easy. Selection of conductors, selection of programming, selection of guest artists to diversify what you're doing on stage. How you hire the staff, how you populate the board. Is the board a reflection of your community? Those have been the easy pieces to change in an orchestra. I won't skip this question 2 yet, but you know, all of this is tied to each other. You know, what you're doing on the stage in terms of programming, who you select as guest artists and conductors, and the programs that you put in place. We have a very strong diversity fellows program. We have a Nouveau Chambers program, which is made up of Black and Latina young musicians from the age of 3rd grade until 12th grade. We've adopted most of the NAS guidelines. We created a DEI department in the orchestra of 4 full-time administrators who are helping to change the culture of the organization. We have a hiring task force in place. We are working to build and support pathways programs that are extant in the United States. And we'll be talking about this more later, but I firmly believe that orchestras ought to be talking to the schools that feed these orchestras, the conservatories, and you know, what we're trying to solve is a systemic problem. You have to take a systemic approach to solving systemic problems. You can't just look at an orchestra and everything that goes on inside an orchestra as the solution. You have to go backwards, and I think that's one area that is ripe for discussion.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that. What would you say are the biggest pushbacks that happen? If you could think of something, if there were no contracts in place, say for instance, we did not have a CBA that's there, or we can reimagine a CBA, right? What do we need to do to ensure that this progress happens? Because you said the staff, you said the board, but we haven't talked about necessarily the orchestra yet. How do we shift the demographics of the orchestra? What things can be imagined? Because a lot of times at least when I've been in these conversations for years at this point, is the notion of the process has to be respected, right? There's a standard, that's what comes in the first thing. We have a standard, and this is the standard of this orchestra, and then there's a process. Like, how do we change, how do we switch that mentality around? Because no one's saying, send someone in who's been there, who's been taking violin lessons at Suzuki and put them in the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. No one's arguing for that, but how do we get more musicians in the orchestra? How does that work? How do we move forward with that? Sorry, Dan.
Let me focus on the touch points inside the orchestra and then put it in context of the pathways. I think the audition work that's going on right now with NAS, with the union support, and really looking at the current audition processes that essentially are the same for most orchestras. Why would we think that would not be as biased as everything else in this country? Why would we not think that it would be as biased as higher ed or law or medicine? So we know there's bias in the audition process. How do you eliminate it or reduce it? And I think a lot of NAS is getting at that. My concern is that if you stop there, you're not going to solve the problem. I have one African American musician in the Cincinnati Symphony, and it's been that way for as long as probably 30 years. If your goal is an orchestra that reflects the community that you serve, I should have 12%. I should have 13%. And so what are the things that have led to an orchestra that is well-resourced, is a community service organization? Why is that? Why has it not changed? You have to look not only at yourself, but you have to look at the pathway. And I think more energy, more focus, more leadership needs to be built around that pathway. If we have 150 people show up at an audition, and maybe 1% or 2% are of color, it's going to be, even if the audition process is perfect and unbiased, how can you possibly change these numbers in my lifetime or your lifetime? So I would encourage all of us to look. We're all part of a system.
Yeah, I think I would add to what you just said, Jonathan. I agree very much with the things that you talked about, but I think that there are two factors that affect that, right? I mean, we know that musicians here, look at this room. The challenge, though, is the question of belonging. And I think for a lot of our orchestras, and that's why I talked a little bit briefly about culture and alignment in the institution. And when I think about this work, I don't think about it just in terms of what is the composition of our orchestra, although that is certainly a very key factor, because if I don't see anybody on stage that looks like me, I'm out, right? And I think, though, that orchestras, and Titus, I know you've experienced this very clearly, orchestras need to reach a place within the musician community of greater alignment around the importance of this work, and how to go about this work, and a deeper understanding of things like structural racism and systemic racism, and what are the barriers that we need to tear down to make orchestras more welcoming and inclusive, and make a culture within those institutions that makes people want to audition and work there. And I think that's certainly a goal that the League's Inclusive Stages program has been pursuing. It's a goal that all of you are pursuing, and I think that we've got a lot of work to do there. And I don't believe that, there are moments where you have to be very courageous in your convictions and do some things sometimes that are tough. But ultimately, everybody's got to want this change to happen if it's going to stick. And my biggest fear, and I'm going to retire in about 2.5 years from this current job, I want to make sure that when I walk out the door, this is part of our DNA, that it lasts forever. How do we get there, right? It's alignment. It's got to be part of what we want and we believe. Because I believe if we succeed at it, we're going to make the art better because of all the different lived experiences that get brought to the task of making that art. and we're going to make our institutions more sustainable and relevant to our communities.
That's a great point. And just kind of piggyback on what you said, I want to kind of go into how is this sustainable for it to be the way that it is? Is it sustainable? Is it sustainable to the audiences that are there? Are the audiences shrinking? Why are they shrinking? How much of the audience is shrinking? You know, we've seen this COVID's kind of, you know, put that on, you know, on rocket boosters, you know. So could you touch on that, please?
In Cincinnati, before the pandemic, our demographics analysis of our audience showed that we were going to lose 50% of our audience in the next 10 years due to death or too old to come to a concert. How the hell can you build an audience retention and audience building strategy without taking a more inclusive approach to what you're doing? How are you going to find half that audience? And the answer is you're not. And so if you look at the imperatives of why this is the right thing to do and how to bake that into the DNA of your organization, you said this a while ago, there's a moral imperative, there's no question. But what I'm finding more traction among the rest of the constituents in the organization, in addition to myself, is that there is an artistic imperative, an opportunity that if you open your arms a little more widely, you enrich your organization artistically just by leaps and bounds. And finally, this business imperative, you know, how, again, if you know you're going to lose 50% of your audience in 10 years, you know, 10 years isn't a long time, it's 120 months. And, you know, you're going to auger yourself into the side of a mountain if you don't change. Now, that's probably not the way to sell it, but you know, there's a business imperative. It's sustainability, and depending on who I'm talking to about this, that one actually grabs people. You know, do you want to be here 10 years from now? Do you want to be a footnote in the cultural life of the community that you're serving?
And you know, we've heard a lot about history here too today, and I can tell you that one of my predecessors years ago, in the 60s, at the Nashville Symphony was Peter Pastryk. And Peter actually has the distinction of having made, at that time, the Nashville Symphony the first integrated orchestra in the South. And there were a number of Black musicians who joined the orchestra, not just one or two, but quite a number, who were part of a program at Fisk University called Harmona Strings. And it was celebrated in Nashville, everybody felt great about it, but when Peter left, a couple of years later, it just completely went away. And so I don't want to see that happen. And I think, so to your point about the imperatives around doing this work, you know, I really believe that we've got to institutionalize the work. For us, we did not create a separate department or a separate committee or anything like that. What we said is this has to become the lens through which we judge everything that we do as an institution. It needs to be across the board. Now, you might need a committee to drive it, I get that, but we've really focused on that as a path toward making progress in this and a path toward making sure that it's still effective well beyond any of the individuals involved in creating that plan. It's bought into by the whole institution.
And this is going to be a very dry comment, but as a manager, these things matter. You have to bake these things into your bylaws, into your collective bargaining agreements, into every job description in the organization. That part of an administrator's job performance is going to be measured by, you know, are they a cultural catalyst or are they a cultural barrier in your organization? We've just launched the process of with our musician leadership of writing job descriptions for the first time for the musicians on the stage. Sounds self-evident. Why do you need a job description for principal oboist? Well, because there are more things that we ask of our musicians, certainly now than 10 years ago. These are people who represent the organization, who are teaching in the community, who are playing music in the community. Let's put that on paper. Think about all the things you do in Nashville beyond, your leadership work, things like that. So things like that. So you document and pour concrete around where you can these things, so that when you and I are no longer around, it's not gonna die.
I can't wait to talk to you offline about how you got everybody to accept the job description.
I guess one of the things I wanted to cover, and thank you so much for that, to get kind of to the very center of the matter, what is the why things don't move quickly in an orchestra? What are some specific examples we can use? You don't have to use like personal stuff like this happening on that person. You gotta name anybody. But what is the why? Why does the orchestra feel like a Titanic in a swimming pool trying to turn around and change any business?
To answer that question, I'm going to have to reveal my regret for not having gotten a behavioral psychology degree instead of a music degree, because so much of the answer to your question, I think, revolves around human behavior, fear of change, fear of letting go of power. And that's a human thing, and you can, history books are filled with this, and my job is to the extent that I can, explain why staying the same is not gonna take you down a path of sustainability, and fear of change is often the fear of the unknown. And, if to the extent that I can do my job better to explain to people who are afraid, whether staff, board, musicians, music directors, it's getting at those two things. It's letting go of power for the greater good and ameliorating that fear of change.
Yeah, and I completely agree with everything you said. But I would just add that part of helping us as leaders address that fear of change in people is the development of trust. I mean, we have to build trust in our institutions, across the institutions, so that people are less afraid of change. And I think that's a really critical step in the whole process. And, one of the things, you were talking about the imperatives here, I just want to say, and I don't remember who said this, but one of my favorite phrases is, if you don't like change, you're gonna hate extinction. That's a really great phrase, because I think that's the kind of crossroads our field is at, and so this work is critical, but I also think it points us at a future that is absolutely almost unimaginable. It's so exciting. That concert last night, the Sphinx Virtuosi, oh my gosh, man, I came away from that inspired about the future and about where the next generation is taking things and how relevant that felt, in that room to that audience. I just thought it was, a great house, a very diverse house, and it felt really relevant and it moved people and it moved me. And so I'm excited. It gave me great hope for the future.
Did you want to expand on that?
No, I've been struck by listening to people who came before us today. Tammy, is Tammy still here? Tammy works right up the road from Cincinnati, Miami University, and your comments really resonated with me today about, orchestras didn't discover Florence Price. I mean, we discovered it within ourselves and probably the most moving thing I've heard today has been the comments from Sean and Blue. It gets back to this culture of belonging. Are we doing enough inside of orchestras to create a landing place that's friendly, that's inclusive, that is belonging? And the answer is no, we're not. And, you know, how you create that culture is probably the single most important part of my job. Running the operations of an orchestra is actually pretty straightforward. It's creating a culture inside your organization of belonging. And that's probably the hardest thing about the job.
If it weren't for the people, right?
Yeah.
But, yeah, it is the hardest part of the job.
There's one thing I wanted to add as a musician, and I guess I can speak clearly about musicians. One of the things that I want to touch on as well, and we want to talk about sustainability of this as well, is many of the musicians, especially Black musicians that I've talked to, it's interesting to see two different perspectives, because a lot of times when I would speak to my other colleagues who are non-Black, a lot of times they would speak about how, you know, management this, management that, management this, management that, management this, management that. Like that was like the Death Star. If you went over to the management side, like all the, you know, the star troopers over there. But what I found very interesting amongst many Black musicians is that a lot of the atrocities that happened to them were from fellow musicians. And most of our experiences have been in the orchestra from other musicians. And the only people we have primarily had conversations with are with management people. And I found that fascinating simply because, like you said before, the change can happen a lot quicker because you can hire someone to change your step. You can recruit people to your board. But a lot of times, and one of the sticky things as far as especially like collective bargaining agreements is, a lot of times when I'm speaking to fellow musicians, sometimes that is not nowhere interested in them, and how many other musicians that are non-Black are here today? If I really think about it, I mean, New York Philharmonic's right down the street, the Met's down the street, New York City Ballet, you know, they know that bond exists. And I've talked to you, they know that bond exists. But a lot of times, many, whether I'm at Sphinx or I'm at Gateways, wherever I am, or here at Black Orchestral Network, I have consistently seen people from the dark side, right, show up consistently to these conversations, except for the musicians. And I'm wondering, a lot of times, does that have to do with, you know, of course, how we're taught, what we think the standard is, things of that sort of nature, and how, I guess, from looking at that, knowing that when you're at the negotiating table, because a lot of times, a lot of this language can come from the management side. It doesn't organically come from the musicians. If you look at the NOS guidelines, it's made up of many different constituents, but it's not necessarily majority musician ran. And it's not from the culture of the orchestra that said, you know what, Black people belong here. You know, so it's like, no, where's my Tchaikovsky? You can get that pops concert out of here. You know, so it's like that type of thing. So what have been your efforts to see, okay, how can I deal with this and make this a critical mass inside the orchestra that happens?
Well, I can only speak for Cincinnati right now. You know, 10 to 15% of the orchestra's members vacated during the pandemic. We kept everybody on payroll. We made minimal cuts, but the pandemic was for a lot of the musicians who had been doing this 40, 50, 60 years. They said, well, maybe I ought to be thinking about the last 20 years of my life in a different way. I'm saying this because we're seeing a sea change in the Cincinnati Symphony in terms of demographics, age, excuse me. And they're bringing a different perspective to the table in these issues than you know, people who got there 40, 50 years ago. What I can't stick my hand in, all as much as I'd like to, would be to you know, encourage those players to take leadership positions in the orchestra. I can't do it because it just, you know, you can't do it. As much as I'd like to do it. But so it's a very interesting time in the Cincinnati Symphony when it comes to, it's impossible to say, well, the musicians feel this. Well, there's 95 musicians in our orchestra. You have 95 opinions, but you can feel a shift going on to where as we surface these issues, we're going to go into negotiations next spring, and we're going to put a lot of things on the table. I took all the pictures of the Mozart. I mean, those things should be in our contract. And I think we're gonna get more receptivity. I hope.
Yeah. You know, and I agree with what you said, but I would add that, you know, we've been very intentional. I'm gonna go back to that word again, about being intentional about this work, because if we're gonna change things, and we have a lot of musicians, a lot of new musicians now, younger musicians, and that's helped. But we are actually, and we have been for now a number of years, I participated in several of these. We've had, you know, training sessions, we've had focus groups, we're doing consulting work currently with, there's Alex, there he is, and some of his colleagues with our not just the orchestra, but across the institution. And we're really trying to help create a greater level of understanding and alignment. And we're not going to win everybody's heart and mind and soul, but we're going to, I think, gradually change the narrative and change the way people feel. And I think it's happened. I mean, we've seen progress, and a number of people have come around. I've had musicians come to me and say, wow, you know, I really never thought about these things that way. And they're really becoming more self-aware. And, you know, and I don't want us to sound like, you know, we're just sort of putting it all on the feet of, you know, on the backs of musicians as the, you know, as a problem, because I don't think that's fair. I think it's really across our institutions, and Lord knows we have some donors that are, you know, problematic too. And, you know, so that's its own set, that's its own, we could be here for a long time talking about that. But you know, I think generally we're making a lot of progress. And I want to say, though, that I also am keenly aware of just how far we have to go yet. And so this work is going to, you know, I'm sure continue well past my own retirement, and yours too, probably, Jonathan. And but it's work worth doing, and it's work that is about creating a new and exciting, I think, future for the orchestra field.
I would just add that in most markets, the symphony orchestra in the particular market, this one probably different, but in most markets like Cincinnati, orchestras are by far and away the largest resource. We raise and spend $100 million every year in Cincinnati because we own a contemporary music company, we own 2 orchestras, we own a chorus festival. So I have to raise $100 million every 365 days in the community. Am I giving $100 million worth of value back to a broad community? The answer is no. There's 52 neighborhoods in Cincinnati. We're really good at reaching about 5 of those. And that's not a recipe for relevance or sustainability. And so it really, if you think of an orchestra as a community resource, like a hospital or a university, it shifts your thinking. You know, when I started in this business, the mission of orchestras was to serve the art of music, very inward looking. And even if you just turn it around and think of an orchestra as an incredible resource, not just for what's going on the stage, but all this collection of unbelievably talented musicians who educate, who record, who teach, who play music outside. If you think of us as a resource, it is an incredible opportunity, and it's an incredible responsibility, because often the orchestras are the campfire, the cultural campfire in the respective in the respective communities.
Absolutely, absolutely. Since we have about 5 minutes left, how do we sustain this? How is this going to be sustainable? Because as we see, especially during the hype when Breonna Taylor and George Floyd lives were taken, you know, there was all these solidarity posts and what these orchestras are going to do, and you know, everybody was really fired up then. Conversation could be very, to a certain extent, raw and honest. You know, people were listening, but now those things, we're seeing quite a backlash of things that are happening now, or pushback. How do you make that sustainable when there's active resistance, and also when things are not as in fashion?
I'll go back to my easy hard list. We're retooling the board of the symphony right now. We're in a governance study. There's no reason in the world why that board shouldn't and can look like Cincinnati, but also convey the same values. If you disconnect the board as a vessel to raise money and actually see the board as a governing body, governance, that where you're not populating the board with, rich old white people in the community, which is what orchestras have done for most of their life, and make the board reflective of the community, that's the start to keep sustainability. Make sure that you've got a culture that I'm held accountable to, the staff is held accountable to. Make sure that you're in your programming and what you're doing on stage is reflective of what the community, the whole community wants. And those type of things will last well beyond the initial rise of focus and attention that we all saw, 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would say that, again, agreeing with everything Jonathan said, in our case, we've actually made the board reflective of the community. Our last board chair was Black. For 3 years, she was our board chair, and she was one of the most extraordinary board chairs I've ever worked with in my career. And she really helped bring all of this work into the forefront of the institution's focus. And I think, as long as the board can now sustain itself in that way, making it reflective of the entire community over the years, it's gonna, the work will be sustainable. We've also had instances, though, where there has been pushback to some of the things, and we saw this. Nashville's a blue dot in a red ocean, right? Tennessee, we all know about the Tennessee 3 and the things that have happened in the national news. But we found coming out of the pandemic, there was a lot of sort of that, we were affected by the political divide in the country. And so we had people accusing us of being political in some of the things that we were doing, and sort of doing this, well, I'm not ever gonna darken your door again. And some of this was from donors and even Masterworks subscribers who had the entire season, classical season. And we had to address those things as they came up, and there were instances where we were able to bring those people to a new level of understanding. One of my favorite lines was, look at the flip side of this. You don't want to be the only person propping this institution up, do you? You've been doing it for a while. You don't want to keep doing it. And to say, in some cases, we're going to have to realize that we're not going to make everybody happy, and some people will go away, but they'll be, as Pam put it to me, she really gave me a lot of strength in those moments. She would say, we may lose that donor, but you know what, there's going to be 10 more people waiting in line to jump in. And she's right. We've seen growth across the community, and it's not from those same 5 neighborhoods.
Absolutely. And I want to say, do you have any closing comments that you'd like to give specific to this audience that's here today? Any optimistic things or things, what do you think Bond can do, or the community of Bond, or people who are supporters of Bond? How can we assist in, really, really having the orchestra be something that we are a part of and also are?
I think we need to think systemically. I think we need to see orchestras as part of a bigger system. And to the extent that the system isn't talking to each other, let's change that. Orchestras should be talking to conservatories. Conservatories should be talking to community music schools, early childhood educators. The whole pathway is what it's going to take. The fact that Bond exists is huge to me, and I can't help but be inspired by looking at the young people in this room and the talent that was on the stage last night. Orchestras are late to the game. We're really late to the game. And, but I think the most important thing for me is we all have to pull pull together if we're gonna change the system. And, we, the orchestras, we find ourselves in the situation that we're in because of systemic issues, both internally and externally.
Yeah, and I would agree, and I would add, that there's a lot Bond can do, and I think helping, think about both fronts. If you think of this as a battle or a war, if you think about the on the one hand, holding us accountable as a field, for this work, that's one thing. But the flip side of that is to help illuminate the way, right? To help capture the imagination of those who would have been obstacles by helping them see the value, helping them see the opportunity, like to experience things like what I experienced last night at that concert. I mean, that kind of thing, I think, really opens up minds and hearts and allows people to say, wow. I mean, it was so clear to me how much more relevant that concert was than a lot of the stuff we put on stage from time to time to a wider community. I mean, it was just crystal clear to me. And I think that's inspiring. And I think if more of the constituents in our institutions could experience that, we'd see the change happening even faster.
Awesome. Well, let's give a collective round of applause.
Vice Jonathan and Anna. What's the next?